So just as an overview for everyone to note, Commerce received about $10.2 million in CDBG-CV funds from HUD. And Commerce had received 32 applications requesting a little over $23 million. And so this just goes to show that there is a huge need in CDBG-CV funds and that many communities in the state have been impacted by COVID-19. And our team spent a lot of time strategically reviewing these applications. And we're just happy to note that Commerce was able to approve 16 of the applications. So at least half of the applications were approved. And these projects that were approved are very much focusing on preventing, preparing for, and responding to COVID-19 and having that strong tie back, which of course is very important moving forward as the pandemic is continuing to evolve. Additionally, these activities that were funded were focused on public facilities, public services, and affordable housing, and to reduce homelessness. And HUD had suspended the public service limitation so there could be more of a focus on these activities, which was great. And then to also note that each project will have a Commerce liaison who will work closely with awardees to ensure that the project is impactful and follows the state requirements. And to note that your Commerce liaison was listed in your startup letters that were sent out on December 13th. And then also that all contract startup terms and conditions should be completed within 9 months of the date of the award letter. And those award letters did go out on December 1st. So just as an overall view too, this process of CV funds is going to look very similar to regular CDBG. So if you're familiar with working with regular CDBG funding, this will look similar as well. There's a few differences with CV, so we are going to touch base on those differences throughout this presentation. So just as a resource is the project administration manual, and I did attach the link to this manual in the chat box. So if you would like to select that and review that as we're going through this presentation, you are more than welcome. But please use the following link to access the CDBG grant manual for additional resources, documents, and information. And in the manual and chapter 1, exhibit 1G is the project startup checklist. And it's a great guide to help folks, and along with your Commerce liaison. So we are here at the department to help folks with any questions you may have in providing TA. And then this manual and its contents, again, will be referenced throughout the webinar. So for timely expenditure requirements, I just hope that folks will please keep this in mind for these timeframes and when you're looking at your project timeframes as well. So HUD mandates that 80% of the CDBG-CV funds must be obligated and expended by July 19th of 2024, and that all funds must be expended by July 19th of 2027. So I'm going to reference that time frame again, but just to note again, when you're looking through your time frames for your own projects as you're moving forward. There are some projects that are ready to get started as soon as possible, which is great to hear because we want to get this funding expended. However, it's important for us to review some of the ineligible costs as you guys are moving forward. And so some of those ineligible costs include items like non-permanent furnishing and fixtures, buildings for general conduct of government, government expenses, political activities. And the two items I wanted to know was equipment and operations. There are exceptions to these for projects that are underneath public service. And then other items include income payments, refinancing existing debt, and then any costs incurred prior to January 21st of 2020. So CDBG-CV funds can only reimburse costs that were incurred on or after January 21st of 2020. So just keeping that in mind if you're looking for reimbursement costs. Wanting to go over the process to a contract. So these items are also laid out in the CDBG manual under Chapter 1 for startup. These will be the main items that we're going to talk through when we start scheduling startup conversations with each grantee, which will be shortly after we're done with this workshop. But just to keep in mind for items number 1, so updating the implementation schedule and your budget with number 2. These are going to be probably very similar to what was submitted in your application. But of course, at this time, there may be some changes, so that will just need to be updated and submitted. Number 3 will be the subrecipient agreement. So this is an agreement for the grantee working with a nonprofit or a for-profit entity that will administer the project or own and operate the facility. So many of our CV projects have a subrecipient. So the majority of these projects are going to be submitting this agreement. Additionally, for number 4, demonstrate a firm commitment of other funding sources. So this was one note is that there is no match requirements for CV funds. And then for number 5, workers' compensation coverage and liability insurance. If you have a construction project, you will need property insurance. So keeping that in mind as well. And then number 6, completing the management plan. And lastly, completing the signatory and depository forms. So for number 7, those 2 forms, at least 2 officials must sign each request for reimbursement. This form will be used to verify signatures on each request for reimbursement that is received throughout the course of the project, and then match those that are listed on the signature certificates. So those are just the main items we want to make sure we're covering to get to contract. And then for contract execution, this process is fairly straightforward, but we just want to keep in mind that it can take up almost maybe up to a month to route and review these contracts. So there is some time that will be needed for executing the contract. But how it's going to look is that we'll confirm the contract liaison and the signatories. And then there will be an internal review at Commerce. And then it'll be sent to grantees via DocuSign for signature. And then a Commerce representative will sign. And then signed copies then will be sent out via DocuSign to all parties. So everyone will get a copy of the contract with all this appropriate signatures. Taylor, I can't see the chat, but was there any questions before I move on?
Yeah, there was just one question from Cindy, and she was just curious whether Commerce should be should be listed as an additionally insured party on the insurance certificates, and they should be.
Okay, perfect.
Or we should be. Yeah.
All right. And then again, just noting about the contract. So for amendments to a contract, if there's any budget changes under $5,000 on a single line item, that can be approved during the request for funds process. But those that are over the $5,000 needs an amendment. And then if there's an implementation schedule change, that can be approved as well during the request for funds process. If there's any scope of work changes, that will need a written request. And then any written request for a contract extension must be submitted at least 60 days prior to contract end date. But just keeping in mind, due to HUD's shortened deadline for the use of CDBG-CV funds, extensions are going to be rare. So again, just noting that time frame that all of our funds for CV has to be expended by July 19th of 2027. So that's why it's just going to be kind of rare for having additional extensions. So the process to release of funds, we're going to go over more in depth in the next few slides of each of these items. But these are just some key factors to consider when you're trying to get to the process to have a release of funds. So your contract has to be executed. we have the federal regulations for real property acquisition and relocation, property income plan, if that's applicable, but most of our projects will not have income. You have your civil rights documentation, your environmental review and environmental release, and then lastly, the procurement documentation. So for real property acquisition and relocation, the Uniform Relocation and Real Property Acquisition Policy Act of 1970, commonly referred to as the Uniform Relocation Act, or the URA. It provides fair and consistent treatment for the purchase or transfer of real property or acquisition, as well as provides uniform, fair, and equitable treatment of persons defined as family, individuals, businesses, nonprofits, and firms who must relocate as a result of acquisition, demolition, or rehab. So many of our CDBG-CV projects that involve acquisition, demolition, rehab, just keeping these in mind as follows. So for acquisition, the objectives of the URA are accomplished through notifying sellers of the property's market value and the voluntary nature of the transaction. For rehabilitation of occupied properties, the objectives of the URA are accomplished through temporary relocation notices. Those are the general information notices, or the GIN, and then advisory services and payments as applicable. And then with section 104D is to one, ensure that certain HUD programs do not reduce the number of affordable housing units by requiring a one-for-one replacement of demolished or converted affordable housing units, and two, to provide special relocation assistance to lower income tenants displaced by certain HUD projects. Next will be the civil rights. So the goal is to assure that there is compliance with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and other state and federal civil rights laws as you implement your CDBG-CV projects. So the civil rights checklist, those are going to be the following documents that are going to need to be reviewed and signed and submitted. So one, we have the Fair Housing Resolution, adopt the non-discrimination, equal employment opportunity, or the EEO policy. Third, adopt the ADA and Section 504 compliant resolution procedure, and then conduct the ADA self-evaluation inventory and transition plan. And lastly, adopting the Hatch Act resolution. So these forms and additional information can be found in Chapter 5 of the CDBG Manual for Civil Rights. And then for environmental review, the environmental review process, as many of you know, can be very time consuming and have a lot of items to be considered depending on the project. So today we're just going over what we thought should be highlighted before or as you're starting your environmental review. So for environmental impact, all CDBG-CV projects are subject to HUD's environmental regulations. There hasn't been any changes to the environmental review with CV projects. And examples of environmentally exempt administrative activities include administrative costs, like project planning, management activities, contract execution of public information efforts. Additionally, with environmental review activities, so that would include the publication of notices, preparations of environmental review record, submission of environmental finding, and request for release of funds to Commerce. And then please to note, do not take any choice limiting actions such as purchasing property, entering a purchase sales agreement, remediation or construction activities, and awarding construction contracts, etc. And we really want to note and stress that. And please contact your Commerce liaison if you have any specific questions about your project, because many of these CV projects are just very different. Everyone's environmental reviews are going to have different components. And so we just want to make sure everyone's project goes as smoothly as possible and meets all the criteria. And then if anyone has any additional questions or needs additional information for the environmental review as well, that is covered in chapter 2 of the manual. Taylor, did we have any other questions so far before I continue?
Nope, you don't have any more.
Okay, perfect. Then we're going to go to procurement. So all CDBG-CV projects must follow applicable local, state, and federal procurement requirements for the procurement of all goods and services, even when goods and services are paid with non-CDBG funds. So this review allows Commerce to provide grantees with the following: so technical assistance, and ensures that grantees have full opportunity to consider all applicable procurement requirements and best practices. And then noting too that procurement is covered in chapter 3 of the CDBG manual. And we're going to go over some of the methods and considerations for procurement as well today. So some of the methods of procurement that you may use are sealed bid method. So that's pretty standard procurement for construction activities. There's the competitive request for proposal procedure, or the RFP. This is required for procurement that's over 100,000 and are recommended for procurement under 100,000, given complexities and or challenges obtaining quotes. And then there's the competitive request for qualifications procedure, or the RFQ. So when procuring professional services such as architectural, engineering, or surveying services with estimated fees over 50,000, requests for qualifications, or those RFQs, are required. Additionally, there could be non-competitive or sole source. So this must have Commerce approval. So sole source procurement involves soliciting only one source, or after soliciting several sources, determining competition is inadequate. There's the micro purchase procedure, which is acquisition of supplies or services generally no greater than 3,000. And then small purchase procedure, which is used for procurement under the 100,000. And the procurement is relatively simple, and a selection can be made based on 3 to 5 rates and work plan quotes. And then to note that procurement for construction activities cannot take place until after the environmental review has been completed. However, you can procure for professional services before that. Some of the key considerations when you're going through procurement is items like the DB, MEB, WEB solicitation. So that's the grantees must proactively reach out to disadvantaged small minority and women business enterprises when soliciting goods and services. There's also Section 3 business concern solicitation. So that's grantees must ensure that economic opportunities are extended to Section 3 workers. So that includes workers who are in the low or very low income, employees of Section 3 business concerns, or participants of Youth Build. And then having full and open competition. So just being fair and do not restrict competition. And then having geographic preference issues. So just making sure you're open to proposals. No Montana contractor preference is allowed with federal dollars. And then just keeping in mind of language, so such as knowledge of the community in an RFQ or an RFP could be too restrictive. And then create written evaluation and selection procedures. So just incorporate an accurate description of identified requirements. So I just want to go over very quickly competitive proposals, because this will mostly be utilized among projects. So when preparing an RFP or an RFQ, these are the main items you need to have included. So just the name of the local government issuing it, the description of the project, the scope of services to be provided by the consultant, amount available budgeted for the scope of services, the method of payment to be used, the time frame for performing the work, and then no bid dollars are to be proposed in a response to an RFQ, and then additional information. Some items to just specify is what information is required for each respondent in order to make the selection. methods and criteria to evaluate the proposals and the weighing of each, the name and telephone number of the local contact, and directions for submitting a response to the RFP or RFQ. And then before you enter into a contract, it has to be sent for CDBG review and approval. So the items that we're going to need is one, a copy of the advertisement for the RFP or RFQ, a copy of that RFP or RFQ, and a summary of the procedures used to select the consultant and a draft of your contract. Also, I want to just touch base on some key points for labor standards because this will be important for whomever is procured. And more information on labor standards can be found in Chapter 6 of the CDBG manual. So some items with the labor standards includes the Davis-Bacon, ensuring compliance with state and federal labor standards, bid documents, educate your contractor and facilitate communication, review certified payrolls, submit payrolls and accompanying documentation, investigate the labor standards violation, and maintain a labor standards files. And then lastly, before I wrap up on the process to release of funds, I want to mention the construction management checklist, which it entails the following. So items like setting up the CDBG-CV contract management file, and then the engineer or architectural services in accordance with the federal and state procurement standards, preparing a draft design plans and specifications and bid and contract documents, requesting all necessary reviews and approvals, advertisement of bid solicitations, assuring appropriate bid security, conducting bid openings, award the construction contract to the lowest possible bidder, hold a pre-construction conference, provide the required notices when initiating a construction activities, and then just monitoring all contractors' activities throughout the construction and conduct the final inspection and file the required notices and reports, and then assuring compliance with labor standards always, and record and document construction management actions in your construction management file. Okay, so for basically once all these projects are able to get the basics done and then you're ready to start requesting funds, it is important to document what activities are being done. So documentation of administrative expenditures. So all expenditures of time and dollars associated with administrative activities must be supported by documentation. So the documentation could be any of the following. So employees' hourly timesheets, copies of travel vouchers with accompanying documentation, documentation of all other direct expenses. So items like the telephone printing, photocopying, and then brief logs for each staff member summarizing the daily activities in conjunction with the preparation of detailed hourly timesheets for CDBG-CV related work. Once you're getting to the point for the request for funds, after the completion of the environmental review, at any time that a local government has met the startup conditions delineated in the contract and can demonstrate a firm commitment for all other funds included in the project budget, CDBG-CV funds then can be provided for all eligible cost expenses incurred by the local government. So just keeping that time frame in mind again too, if you're looking for reimbursement costs. So that's again for incurred on or after January 21st of 2020. And then up to 10% of CV award funds can go to administrative costs like project administration, professional services, legal, audit fees, and travel and training. And awardees cannot submit a request for funds until they have executed a contract and have met requirements for Commerce to release funds. And then the documentation you're going to need for the request for funds. So funds are requested by submitting a draw request along with actual invoices. So a request for funds typically can take about 15 days to process. And then the required documents are going to be one, a request for funds form, a progress report form, the uniform status of funds spreadsheet, a uniform invoice tracking spreadsheet, and then additional Apple invoice purchasing orders and or agreements. And then keeping in mind for periods of construction draws, it also has to include records of employee interviews, certification of labor compliance, and copies of reviewed weekly payrolls. So these documents that I went over and additional information can be found on Chapter 4 in the manual when it comes to the request for funds. And then want to go over just reporting and communication throughout your project. So please keep your commerce liaison updated on progress and to submit a progress report every 3 months or with every request for funds. I put in that link again for the administration manual to review, and then your commerce liaison will schedule monitoring visits. And then this might be jumping a little ahead for most projects, but there are a few projects that have shorter timeframes. So I just want to review the main closeout points. So one, the project engineer, architect, or appropriate professional should submit a certificate of substantial completion. And then two, within 90 days of that, the awardee should submit their project completion report. And then within 30 days of the project closing out, Commerce will close out the project by issuing a notice of project of completion. And grantees must retain project records for 5 years from closeout dates. And then if you guys need additional information on closing out, that is found in the manual on Chapter 12. So at this time, are there any general questions that are not project specific? We went through quite a bit of information, so I'm going to go ahead and put on my video too. So Taylor, do we have any questions at this time? And
Yeah.
also to folks, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions. I'd like this to kind of be just more of an open conversation too, so feel free. Go ahead, Taylor. Sorry.
Yeah, so we had one question from Anne McCauley about whether certificates of completion are required for acquisition projects. And I think maybe Mackenzie has done an acquisition project and would have more thoughts on this front if she's on.
Sure. Okay, so with acquisition, with acquisition projects, because there's no construction, the completion is basically your documents that you're closed with the sale. So all the executed documents from the sale of the property is kind of your certificate of completion. We just need copies of all of those.
Great, thanks, Mackenzie. And then it looks like Cindy maybe had another question about provide an overview of requirements for public service projects. Cindy, did you have like more specific nuances for public services? Like, are you curious about that in relation to procurement or environmental review? For the most part, public service projects have to follow all of the same CDBG requirements, but obviously the environmental review process will be a little bit different. So it might be, I guess we might need a little bit more information to answer that question.
Sure. Yeah, this is Cindy Kennedy with Missoula County. I understand the environmental review process will be different, and in our case, I don't imagine there'll be any procurement. So I just want to confirm that, because we'll have a subrecipient agreement that we applied for on their behalf. And then I know that years ago we were part of the city. And so I also did public service grants for the city entitlement CDBG funding. And we required subrecipients to provide quarterly reports with a lot of demographic data that demonstrated the clientele they were serving and that sort of stuff. So I believe that the reporting could be a little bit more robust with public service grants. And I just wanted to, there may be other things that I'm just not even thinking about right now, because it's been a while since I've worked on those kinds of projects, but I know that they're a little bit different. So if you could speak to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so this might be a question we'll have to get back to you on. Historically, the state of Montana hasn't funded many public service projects. Our normal CDBG programs do not normally fund public service projects. So we might have to do a little bit of digging to see if there's any questions in terms of our reporting to HUD that we would want to add on to that quarterly report form for public service projects. We only have a couple of them within the CDBG-CV cohort. So if it sounds like an okay plan to you, Cindy, we'll just make sure that we're covering all of our bases in terms of what we need to report to HUD, and we'll communicate any specific CDBG, or excuse me, specific public service requirements in the startup call with you guys, if that works for you.
Yeah, that works great. Just one last question, and maybe this was already asked and I missed it. Is this PowerPoint going to be available to us, or did I miss a link somewhere?
So yes, it will be, it's recorded and it'll be posted on the department's website underneath the CDBG CARES page.
Fabulous, thank you.
Yeah. Great questions. Any others?
Yeah, I think Lorette had a question that Mackenzie answered in the chat. She was curious whether grantees need to post a sign at the project site acknowledging CDBG-CV funding. And Mackenzie just responded with, we don't have a requirement to have a project sign. However, if there is a project sign that you're going to post at the project site, the Department of Commerce should be listed as one of the funding sources. So if you're already putting something up, we would love to be added, but no requirement to do so. Mackenzie, did you have anything else to add on that front?
Sure. The only thing to note is if you need our logo, we can provide that as program specialists. So just shoot us an email and we can get you whatever form you need to make sure that's on the project sign.
Great. And then it looks like Robin from Red Lodge Area Community Foundation also had a question about where they can find their project liaison. Do you want to answer that one, Chandler?
Yeah, so the project liaison is on your startup letters, and that's listed who's heading up your project. And then if for whatever reason, maybe if you can't find it, you're welcome to email or contact me and I can help direct you on who your liaison is.
And then Chandler, I think you mentioned this earlier on in the presentation, but in terms of next steps from us here at the Department of Commerce, we're going to reach out, right, to schedule startup calls with everybody. And so, Robin, that will also be with, whomever at the local level that needs to be involved. I think Chandler is going to sit in on all of them, and then your project liaison as well.
Correct. Yeah, it'll be soon after this workshop. We'll be contacting folks to start scheduling those startup conversations. Yes. All right.
This is Jim Morton with the Human Resource Council in Missoula. There was a question in the chat about indirect costs.
Oh, I see that. It's above Lorette's question there, Chandler. Are indirect costs allowed with an indirect cost rate?
Maybe a question for you, Mackenzie, to ask.
Well, I was going to say, I'm going to have to look at that. We typically, so with like grant administration or those type of activities, a lot of the times that's contracted out with an entity. So the rates are kind of determined during the procurement process. So if there isn't that aspect to it, I'm not 100% sure, but that's definitely something we can look into and then get back to everyone about.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So hearing none, but of course, everyone is welcome to email us if there are any additional questions, and then contacting your liaison as well. But these are a list of the project liaisons. So each of you in your startup letters, again, it should be listed with your commerce liaison. And you have one of these contacts assigned to you. And then I just want to say thank you for everyone attending, and remember that this was recorded. So we will be posting this on our website under the CDBG Cares page. And we wish you all the best moving forward on your projects. So thank you.